The CEO laughed at his tiny repair shop in front of 200 people, and nobody noticed the folded blueprints hidden inside his old pickup truck. The crowd laughed with her. Cameras recorded every second. And standing beside him, his 12-year-old daughter watched her father's dignity get tested in a way no child should ever have to witness. The city of Fairmont was built on industry. For generations, factories had powered the local economy, and giant companies controlled most of the opportunities. Sterling Motors stood above them all. Its factories stretched across hundreds of acres. Its dealerships dominated the market. And at the center of that empire stood Victoria Sterling, a CEO known for her intelligence, ambition, and ability to win. On the opposite side of town sat Walker Repair, a modest two-bay garage squeezed between a feed store and an aging hardware shop. The building was old. The sign needed paint. The parking lot was gravel instead of concrete. Yet every morning before sunrise, Ethan Walker unlocked the garage doors and got to work. At 42 years old, Ethan had spent most of his life fixing problems other people gave up on. Engines, transmissions, businesses, sometimes even people. Since losing his wife years earlier, he had raised Lily alone while building the small repair shop into a trusted part of the community. He never became wealthy. He never appeared on magazine covers. But customers returned year after year because they trusted him. And to Ethan, trust mattered more than attention. On a bright Saturday afternoon, Fairmont's annual Business Growth Summit filled the downtown convention center with executives, investors, reporters, and entrepreneurs. Victoria Sterling was the featured speaker. Her company sponsored the event. Her image appeared on banners hanging throughout the building. Success followed her everywhere. Ethan attended only because one of his suppliers had offered him a free ticket. He hoped to learn something useful. Maybe meet a few contacts. Maybe find new opportunities for the garage. Lily came along because she enjoyed seeing parts of the business world that most children never experienced. The event moved smoothly until a panel discussion shifted toward small businesses and local competition. Victoria stood confidently beneath the stage lights while cameras focused on every word she spoke. The audience listened carefully. Then someone asked what she thought about independent repair shops competing against large corporations. Victoria smiled. It was a polished smile, the kind developed after years of public appearances. Competition is healthy, she said, as long as people understand the difference between a serious business and a hobby. Laughter rolled through parts of the room. Ethan barely reacted, but Lily glanced toward him. Something about the comment felt directed. Then Victoria's eyes found him sitting several rows back. She recognized him immediately. Walker Repair had become known among local drivers for solving difficult problems that larger companies often avoided. Take that little repair shop over there, Victoria continued casually. Several audience members turned toward Ethan. Nice people, hard workers. But let us be realistic. Businesses like that survive because companies like ours build the market around them. More laughter followed. Lily felt her face grow warm. Ethan remained still. The convention hall glowed beneath bright lights while hundreds of eyes shifted toward him. For a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Someone nearby whispered. Another person chuckled. Cameras captured everything. Victoria folded her hands and continued speaking about growth, scale, and corporate efficiency. Yet Lily no longer heard the presentation. She only heard the laughter. When the session ended, people gathered around Victoria for photographs and interviews. Others quietly discussed the exchange. Ethan and Lily walked toward the parking lot in silence. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the pavement. Traffic moved steadily through downtown streets. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, Lily looked up at her father. Why did she do that? Ethan unlocked the truck and opened the passenger door. Because people see the world differently. Lily frowned. That is not an answer. Ethan smiled gently. It is the only one I have. She climbed into the truck. He settled behind the wheel. For a moment, he simply looked through the windshield toward the skyline, where Sterling Motors signs stood above several buildings. Does it bother you? Lily asked quietly. Ethan thought carefully. Not as much as it bothers you. She looked away. The answer was true. The truck started with a familiar rumble. As they pulled onto the highway, evening sunlight streamed through the windows. Neither noticed the folded blueprints resting inside a weathered folder on the seat behind them. Neither noticed because those plans had become part of Ethan's daily routine months earlier. They were just sketches, just ideas. Just possibilities. At least that was what everyone else would have believed. And while the city spent the weekend talking about the CEO who mocked a tiny repair shop, Ethan spent it studying a forgotten property on the edge of town that nobody else wanted anymore. The video of the business summit spread across Fairmont before sunrise the next morning. By lunchtime, thousands of people had watched the moment Victoria Sterling dismissed Ethan Walker's repair shop. Some shared it because they admired her confidence. Others shared it because they enjoyed public humiliation. A few quietly defended Ethan. But in the fast-moving world of social media, dignity rarely traveled as quickly as mockery. Inside Walker Repair, however, life continued much the same. The garage doors opened at 7 o'clock. The smell of motor oil filled the air. Customers arrived with transmission problems, warning lights, strange noises, and old trucks that had survived more winters than anyone could count. Ethan moved from one vehicle to another with the steady focus that had defined most of his adult life. He did not mention the video. He did not complain about the summit. He simply worked. Yet Lily noticed something others would have missed. Her father spent every free moment studying the folder he kept locked inside an old filing cabinet near the back office. The same folder containing the blueprints. The same folder he reviewed almost every night after closing. On Tuesday evening, after the last customer left, Lily sat at the small desk doing homework while Ethan spread several documents across the workbench. The overhead lights cast long shadows across the concrete floor. Outside, the sky darkened into deep shades of blue and purple. "Is this what you were looking at in the truck?" Lily asked. Ethan glanced up. "What makes you think that?" "Because every time you look at those papers, you stop hearing everything around you." He smiled. She was right. The blueprints showed a large industrial property located on the eastern edge of Fairmont. Most residents barely remembered it existed. Years ago, the facility manufactured specialized automotive components. Then market changes arrived. Production slowed. Ownership changed hands multiple times. Eventually, the factory closed. For nearly a decade, it sat empty, collecting dust behind rusting fences and faded warning signs. To most people, it was a useless piece of real estate. To Ethan, it looked like possibility. "Why do you care so much about that place?" Lily asked. Ethan leaned back against the workbench. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought. "Have you ever noticed that everyone wants something new?" She nodded. "Of course. New cars, new buildings, new ideas." He looked toward the blueprints. Sometimes people become so focused on what is next that they forget to look at what is already there. Lily studied the factory drawings. She did not fully understand yet, but she trusted him. She always had. The following afternoon, Ethan drove across town after work and parked near the abandoned property. Tall chain-link fences surrounded the facility. Broken weeds pushed through cracks in the pavement. The massive buildings stretched across several acres beneath the afternoon sun. Most people saw decay. Ethan saw structure, opportunity, potential. He spent nearly an hour walking the perimeter, taking notes, measuring distances, imagining possibilities. Meanwhile, inside Sterling Motors headquarters, Victoria attended a meeting with senior executives. Large digital displays filled the conference room walls. Market reports covered the tables. Financial projections dominated every discussion. Sterling Motors remained successful, but cracks had begun appearing beneath the surface. Competition increased. Customer expectations changed. Service demands evolved. During the meeting, one executive raised concerns about independent repair businesses gaining influence among local customers. Victoria barely looked up from her reports. "Small shops survive because they stay small," she replied confidently. "Scale always wins." Nobody challenged her. Success had a way of discouraging disagreement. Later that evening, another unexpected visitor arrived at Walker Repair. An older customer named Frank Delaney pulled his pickup into the parking lot just before closing. Ethan had serviced Frank's vehicles for nearly 15 years. Trust like that could not be purchased. It had to be earned. Frank stepped inside carrying a box. "Found something you might want." Ethan opened it carefully. Inside sat several old photographs of the abandoned factory. Images taken decades earlier when the facility still operated at full capacity. Hundreds of employees. Busy production lines. Delivery trucks. Community events. History. "Where did these come from?" Ethan asked. Frank smiled. "My father worked there." For the next hour, They sat together reviewing photographs and memories. Frank described how the factory once supported hundreds of families, how local businesses flourished because of it, how entire neighborhoods grew around the opportunities it created. When he finally left, Ethan remained alone in the garage studying the photographs. The pieces were beginning to connect. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to reveal a larger picture. The abandoned factory was more than a building. It was a foundation, a sleeping giant hidden in plain sight. Across town, the city continued laughing at the repair shop owner featured in the viral video. They saw a small garage, a modest business, a man who stayed quiet when challenged. What they did not see was the growing stack of factory plans, financial calculations, and handwritten notes filling the back office of Walker Repair. And while everyone else focused on the insult that had happened, Ethan spent another late night preparing for something nobody believed was possible. By the end of the month, the entire city seemed to know Ethan Walker's name, but not for the reasons anyone would have wanted. The video from the business summit continued circulating online. New clips appeared every week. Some edited the footage with dramatic music. Others added captions mocking the small repair shop owner who sat silently while a powerful CEO questioned his place in the market. The internet had given him a nickname, the repair shop dreamer. People repeated it in comments, on local radio programs, and even during conversations at coffee shops across Fairmont. Most of them had never spoken to Ethan. Most had never visited his garage. Yet somehow they felt qualified to decide what he could or could not become. Inside Walker Repair, however, very little changed. Customers still arrived before opening. Engines still needed rebuilding. Air conditioning systems still failed during the hottest days of summer. Life remained stubbornly ordinary. Ethan preferred it that way. Every morning he unlocked the garage doors, turned on the lights, and focused on the next problem in front of him. Yet behind the familiar routine, something else was happening. The back office had slowly transformed into a planning center. Factory blueprints covered the walls. Financial projections filled notebooks. Old photographs from the abandoned facility sat beside market reports and supply chain studies. While the city laughed at his dreams, Ethan was quietly studying opportunities nobody else seemed interested in noticing. One Thursday evening, Lily stepped into the office carrying 2 cups of coffee. She placed one beside her father and looked around the room. Papers covered nearly every available surface. Maps, property records, handwritten notes. "It looks like a detective movie in here," she said. Ethan smiled. "That bad?" "Worse." She pointed toward a section of the wall covered with diagrams and calculations. "Most people have family photos." Ethan took a sip of coffee and studied the plans. "Most people are probably smarter than I am." Lily laughed. The sound filled the small office and briefly pushed away the weight of long hours and difficult decisions. Then her expression softened. "Do you really think it can work?" Ethan looked at the old factory photographs sitting nearby. Hundreds of workers. Production lines stretching into the distance. A building that once supported entire neighborhoods. "I think people stopped believing in that place too early." Outside, the evening sun cast golden light across the garage parking lot. Inside, Ethan returned to his calculations. The numbers were challenging. The risks were real. Yet every time he reviewed the possibilities, the same conclusion appeared. The abandoned facility was not worthless. It was misunderstood. Across town, Victoria Sterling stood before investors during another corporate presentation. The room sparkled with glass walls, polished surfaces, and expensive technology. Sterling Motors remained one of the region's most successful companies. Yet subtle concerns had begun surfacing beneath the confidence. Market reports showed shifting customer behavior. Independent service providers continued growing. New business models attracted attention from younger consumers. During the meeting, one investor asked whether the company had plans to modernize certain operations. Victoria answered confidently, but privately she understood the challenge. The market was changing faster than many executives wanted to admit. Later that night, she drove past Walker Repair while returning from a dinner event. Traffic slowed briefly near the intersection. Her eyes drifted toward the small garage. The lights were still on. Nearly 10 o'clock. Through the front window, she could see Ethan working alone. Most people would have gone home hours earlier. Something about that image stayed with her longer than expected. Not because she felt sympathy, because determination always caught her attention, even when she disagreed with it. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. A retired banker named Harold Benson walked into Walker Repair, carrying a folder under one arm. Ethan recognized him immediately. Harold had been a customer for years. Reliable, honest, practical, the kind of person who rarely wasted words. After a routine conversation about vehicle maintenance, Harold glanced toward the back office. Still studying that factory? Ethan nodded. Trying to. Harold remained silent for several seconds. Then he opened the folder. Inside were property records and historical financial reports connected to the facility. Ethan stared at him. Where did you get these? Harold smiled faintly. I spent 30 years reviewing investments. He placed the documents on the counter. Sometimes opportunities hide where nobody wants to look. The words sounded familiar, almost identical to lessons Ethan had taught Lily throughout her life. For the next hour, they reviewed records together. Numbers, ownership histories, operational costs, potential challenges, potential advantages. Nothing guaranteed success. Nothing promised easy answers. Yet with every page they examined, Ethan's conviction grew stronger. When Harold finally left, he paused beside the garage door. Most people think dreams are dangerous. Ethan nodded. Sometimes they are. Harold smiled. No. The dangerous thing is when everybody starts believing the same limitation. After he disappeared into the parking lot, Ethan remained standing quietly beside the documents. Outside, customers continued arriving. Inside, the plans continued growing. The city still laughed at the repair shop dreamer. The headlines still favored the powerful CEO. The market still belonged to larger companies. Yet somewhere beyond the noise, beyond the assumptions, and beyond the public ridicule, a different story was slowly beginning to take shape. 3 weeks later, Ethan Walker stood alone inside the abandoned factory for the first time. The silence felt enormous. Dust floated through shafts of sunlight breaking through high windows nearly 30 feet above the concrete floor. Empty production lines stretched across the building like forgotten roads. Rusted equipment sat motionless beneath decades of neglect. To most people, the place looked finished. A monument to failure. A reminder of opportunities that had disappeared long ago. Yet Ethan could not stop imagining what it had once been. More importantly, he could not stop imagining what it might become again. The property owner had finally agreed to allow a formal inspection before the upcoming auction. Most interested buyers had already dismissed the facility. Cleanup costs were too high. Repairs would be expensive. The risks outweighed the rewards. At least according to conventional wisdom. Ethan walked slowly through the massive structure carrying a clipboard and flashlight. Every few minutes he stopped to take notes. Measurements. Structural observations. Utility connections. Potential layouts. While others focused on what was broken, he focused on what still worked. The building had problems. Plenty of them. But beneath the dust and damage remained something valuable. Strong foundations. Good access routes. Existing infrastructure. Possibility. Hours later, he climbed a metal staircase overlooking the main production floor. The view stretched across nearly 600,000 square feet of industrial space. For a moment, he simply stood there. The afternoon light painted long golden shadows across the concrete. Somewhere in the distance, a loose sheet of metal rattled softly in the breeze. The factory felt asleep rather than dead, waiting rather than finished. That evening, Ethan returned home exhausted. Lily sat at the kitchen table working on a school project when he walked through the door. One look at his face told her everything. You saw it, didn't you? Ethan nodded. I did. She closed her notebook immediately. And he set down his keys and smiled faintly. It is bigger than I imagined. Lily laughed. That sounds like a problem. It probably is. Yet there was something different in his eyes. Hope mixed with determination. The kind that appears when someone sees a path others cannot. Across town, Victoria Sterling faced challenges of her own. Quarterly reports had arrived, and several divisions under Sterling Motors were underperforming expectations. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing that threatened the company immediately. Yet the numbers moved in the wrong direction. Customer loyalty had become harder to maintain. Service satisfaction ratings fluctuated. Market behavior shifted faster than forecast models predicted. During a leadership meeting, one executive suggested exploring partnerships with independent service providers to strengthen customer relationships. Victoria dismissed the idea almost instantly. We do not need partnerships, she said. We need efficiency. The room fell quiet. Nobody argued. Yet several executives exchanged brief glances. Confidence remained one of Victoria's greatest strengths. Sometimes it was also her greatest blind spot. Meanwhile, the city continued talking about Ethan. Not because of his plans. Nobody knew about those yet. Instead, the nickname persisted. The repair shop dreamer. Some used it affectionately now. Others still intended it as criticism. Either way, the story refused to disappear. Local podcasts discussed him. Community pages shared updates whenever someone spotted him near the old factory. Rumors multiplied. Most were completely wrong. One Saturday morning, Ethan arrived at the garage to find an unexpected gathering waiting outside. Several longtime customers stood near the entrance holding coffee cups. Frank Delaney was there. Harold Benson was there. A retired welder named Carl Mercer stood nearby. So did two former factory workers who recognized Ethan from recent visits to the property. Ethan looked around in confusion. Did I forget a meeting? Frank laughed. No. Harold stepped forward. We wanted to talk. Over the next hour, something remarkable happened. One person after another shared memories of the old factory. Stories of parents who worked there. Careers that started there. Families supported by jobs that no longer existed. Then the conversation shifted. Quietly. Naturally. Toward the future. If somebody brought it back, Carl said carefully, people would support it. Another man nodded. More than you think. Ethan listened without interrupting. He had spent months carrying the weight of his idea alone. Hearing others speak about it changed something. Not because they solved his problems. Because they reminded him he was not the only person who believed the factory still mattered. That evening, after everyone left, Ethan remained in the garage office reviewing auction information. The date was approaching faster than expected. Financial challenges remained enormous. The risks remained real. Yet support was beginning to appear from unexpected places. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. Inside, stacks of documents covered the desk. Property reports, inspection summaries, cost projections, market studies. Then his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Ethan answered cautiously. The voice on the other end introduced itself as a representative from a regional investment group. They had heard about his interest in the factory. They wanted a meeting. Ethan listened quietly as the caller explained. When the conversation ended several minutes later, he remained seated without moving. The rain continued falling outside. The office felt unusually still. Because for the first time since the idea began, someone beyond his small circle had noticed what he was trying to build. And somewhere across the city, hidden behind boardrooms, forecasts, and corporate confidence, forces much larger than Ethan realized were already beginning to move toward the same forgotten factory. The meeting with the investment group took place on a gray Tuesday morning in a modest office building overlooking the river. Ethan Walker arrived 10 minutes early, carrying a worn leather folder filled with notes, photographs, and factory reports. The lobby around him reflected the polished confidence of corporate success. Glass walls, modern furniture, expensive artwork. It felt very different from the grease-stained floors and tool cabinets waiting back at Walker Repair. Yet Ethan never seemed uncomfortable in places like this. Years of solving difficult problems had taught him something important. Confidence did not come from appearances. It came from preparation. Two men and a woman greeted him inside the conference room. Their questions began immediately. Why the factory? Why now? What made him believe the property still had value when so many others had walked away? Ethan answered calmly. He spoke about local workers, existing infrastructure, changing market demands, community trust, long-term service models. He spoke about opportunities hidden beneath neglect. The conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. When it finally ended, nobody made promises. Nobody offered immediate funding. Yet as Ethan walked toward the parking lot, he sensed something important had shifted. For the first time, people with real resources had listened carefully instead of laughing. Back in Fairmont, the auction date moved closer. Rumors spread quickly. Developers from neighboring cities reportedly planned to bid on the property. Logistics companies showed interest. Warehouse operators had conducted inspections. Every new rumor increased the pressure. The abandoned factory no longer looked forgotten. It looked valuable. That worried Ethan more than he admitted. Every serious bidder represented another obstacle. Every new offer increased the possibility that the factory would become something entirely different. Meanwhile, Walker Repair remained busy. The city still needed repairs. Customers still trusted him. Yet Lily noticed subtle changes. Her father slept less. He spent more evenings reviewing spreadsheets and financial projections. Sometimes she found him sitting alone in the office long after closing, studying numbers beneath a single lamp. One night, she carried 2 sandwiches into the office and set one beside him. Ethan looked up and smiled. "You were supposed to be asleep." Lily sat down across from him. "You were supposed to be eating." He laughed softly. The tension eased for a moment. Then her eyes drifted toward the factory plans covering the wall. "Are you scared?" The question lingered between them. Ethan considered pretending otherwise. Instead, he chose honesty. "A little." Lily nodded. "Good." He raised an eyebrow. "Good. If it was easy, everybody would do it." For a moment, Ethan simply stared at her. Then he smiled again. Sometimes children understood things adults complicated. Across town, Victoria Sterling faced mounting frustrations of her own. A quarterly review meeting had turned tense. Several market indicators continued moving in unfavorable directions. Service revenues showed weakness. Customer retention metrics had softened. Competitors were adapting faster than expected. During a presentation, one analyst displayed a chart highlighting emerging trends. Independent service networks appeared repeatedly throughout the report. Victoria watched silently. Then she noticed something else. A local consumer survey listed Walker Repair among the most trusted automotive businesses in the region. The room continued discussing broader market conditions, but her attention lingered on that single detail. Trust. The one thing corporations spent millions trying to build. Ethan had earned it with a small garage and years of consistency. Later that week, another surprise arrived. Several former factory workers visited Walker Repair together. Some had not seen the facility in years. Others still drove past it occasionally, avoiding the memories attached to it. They gathered near the service bays while Ethan finished a repair. One of them finally stepped forward. "We heard you were trying to buy it." Ethan hesitated. Trying is probably the right word. The man nodded slowly. "If somebody brings that place back, it should be someone who actually cares." The others agreed. One by one, they shared stories. Families supported by factory wages. Friendships built over decades. Pride in work that once mattered deeply to the community. The conversations lasted nearly 2 hours. By the time they left, Ethan understood something he had not fully appreciated before. The factory was not merely a business opportunity. It was emotional territory, history, identity, hope. That realization made the responsibility feel heavier than ever. A few days later, a large sign appeared outside the abandoned property announcing the upcoming auction. Drivers slowed to read it. News outlets covered it. Speculation intensified. The city suddenly remembered the factory existed. That evening, Ethan parked outside the gates and sat quietly inside his truck. The setting sun reflected against broken windows and rusted metal structures. Wind moved through weeds growing along the fence line. Everything looked peaceful. Yet beneath that stillness, pressure continued building. The auction was approaching. Competing interests were gathering. Financial risks remained enormous. Across the city, powerful companies studied the same property. Powerful investors examined the same numbers. Ethan sat there until darkness settled over Fairmont. Then his phone vibrated. A message from the investment group appeared on the screen. 3 simple words. "We need meeting." Ethan stared at the message for several seconds. Because deep down, he already knew that whatever happened next would determine whether the factory remained a forgotten memory or became something entirely new. The second meeting with the investment group lasted less than 30 minutes. Yet it changed the atmosphere around Ethan Walker's dream completely. The representatives no longer treated his ideas as interesting possibilities. They treated them as serious business discussions. That difference mattered. For months, Ethan had carried the vision alone. Then a few trusted customers believed. Then former factory workers. Now people who managed millions of dollars were asking detailed questions about implementation instead of feasibility. As he drove back to Walker Repair that afternoon, the city looked strangely different. The same streets, the same buildings, the same traffic lights. Yet everything felt closer to a turning point. Not because success was guaranteed, because failure was no longer the only outcome people imagined. At the garage, Lily was waiting near the service bay. She could tell immediately that something had happened. "Good news?" she asked. Ethan set his truck keys on the workbench. "Maybe." She rolled her eyes dramatically. You always say maybe. He laughed softly. That is because life likes surprises. Lily folded her arms. Did they say no? No. Her eyes widened. Did they say yes? Ethan smiled. Not exactly. The answer frustrated her, but it was the truth. The investment group had expressed interest. Real interest. Yet they wanted more information. More planning. More certainty. In business, enthusiasm alone never moved millions of dollars. Confidence required evidence. Over the following days, Ethan worked harder than ever. Repairs filled his mornings. Meetings consumed his afternoons. Research occupied his evenings. Sleep became a luxury. Yet despite the exhaustion, something remarkable happened. People began showing up to help. Not because he asked, because they believed. Frank Delaney arrived with contacts from the transportation industry. Harold Benson introduced him to retired financial professionals willing to review projections. Former factory employees volunteered knowledge about the facility's original operations. Every conversation added another piece to the puzzle. Every person strengthened the foundation beneath the dream. One evening, while reviewing reports in the office, Ethan noticed a growing stack of handwritten notes left by customers. Most were simple messages. Encouragement. Support. Memories of the factory. One note stood out. The city needs builders more than critics. Ethan read it twice, then quietly placed it beside the blueprints. Across town, Victoria Sterling faced a different reality. Sterling Motors remained profitable, but pressure continued building beneath the surface. Several major contracts were under review. Competition increased in areas once considered secure. During an executive strategy meeting, analysts presented customer feedback reports highlighting a trend that caught Victoria's attention. Consumers increasingly valued trust, transparency, and local relationships. Independent service providers ranked surprisingly high in satisfaction surveys. One name appeared repeatedly: Walker Repair. Victoria stared at the report longer than necessary. She remembered the summit, the laughter, the confidence she felt standing on stage. At the time, the moment seemed insignificant. Now she found herself thinking about it more often than she cared to admit. Not because Ethan had challenged her. He never had. Because he had not. Most people reacted when underestimated. Most people argued. Most people defended themselves. Ethan simply kept working. That unsettled her more than criticism ever could. A week later, news broke that several developers had withdrawn from the factory auction. Rising renovation costs frightened them away. Some investors followed. Others redirected attention elsewhere. The list of serious bidders became shorter. Yet the remaining competitors were stronger than ever. Large logistics companies, manufacturing groups, investment firms, organizations with resources far beyond anything Ethan controlled. The challenge had not disappeared. It had evolved. One rainy afternoon, Ethan visited the factory again. Water tapped against broken windows high above the production floor. Echoes drifted through empty corridors. The building remained silent, yet somehow less lonely than before. He walked slowly through the vast structure carrying a flashlight. Every visit revealed something new. A forgotten storage area. A preserved maintenance system. A section requiring less renovation than expected. Small discoveries. Small reasons to keep believing. Eventually, he climbed to the second-level walkway overlooking the main floor. Rain streaked the windows. Gray light filtered through the building. For several minutes, he simply stood there. Then his phone rang. The caller identification displayed a name he recognized immediately. One of the investment group partners. Ethan answered. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. Yet when it ended, he remained completely still. The partner had requested another meeting. Not next month. Not next week. Tomorrow morning. Something in the man's voice suggested urgency. Outside, thunder rolled softly in the distance. Inside the factory, Ethan looked across the empty production floor stretching beneath him. The city still viewed the property as a relic of the past. Most people still believed larger companies would eventually claim it. Yet standing there in the fading afternoon light, Ethan sensed the story entering a new chapter. Somewhere beyond the rain-covered windows, decisions were being made. Deals were being discussed. Opportunities were shifting. And while Fairmont continued focusing on the companies everyone already knew, a quiet repair shop owner was moving steadily closer to a future nobody had expected him to reach. The meeting the next morning began before sunrise. Ethan Walker arrived carrying the same worn leather folder that had followed him through months of planning, research, and quiet determination. The investment group's office overlooked the river, but this time the atmosphere felt different. More serious, more focused. Gone were the exploratory questions and polite curiosity. The people waiting inside already knew the numbers. They already understood the opportunity. Now they wanted to discuss execution. For nearly 4 hours, they reviewed market studies, operational models, staffing projections, and redevelopment plans. Every assumption faced scrutiny. Every estimate faced challenge. Ethan welcomed it. He had spent too many nights preparing for this moment to fear difficult questions. By the end of the meeting, one thing had become clear. The factory was no longer just a dream discussed in a small repair shop office. It had become a legitimate project attracting serious attention. Yet with that attention came greater pressure. When Ethan returned to Fairmont that afternoon, he found several local reporters standing outside Walker Repair. Word had begun spreading. Nobody knew the details, but enough information had leaked to fuel speculation. Questions followed him everywhere. Was he involved in the factory auction? Was he leading an investment group? Was Walker Repair expanding? Ethan politely declined interviews. He answered no questions. The less he said publicly, the more people seemed to talk. Meanwhile, something unexpected began happening across the city. Former factory workers started gathering at local diners, coffee shops, and community centers. Conversations that once focused on memories slowly shifted toward possibilities. People discussed jobs, economic growth, opportunity. For the first time in years, the abandoned factory felt relevant again. One evening, Ethan and Lily stopped at a small diner after a long day. As they entered, several people greeted them warmly. A few months earlier, many of those same people had laughed at the repair shop dreamer nickname. Now their expressions carried something different. Respect. It arrived quietly. The strongest forms usually did. As they settled into a booth, Lily noticed it too. People look at you differently now. Ethan glanced around the room. Maybe. She smiled knowingly. Definitely. Before he could respond, an older woman approached their table. Ethan recognized her immediately. Her husband had worked at the factory for nearly 20 years before it closed. She placed a folded photograph on the table. The image showed hundreds of workers standing proudly outside the facility decades earlier. "I thought you should have this," she said softly. Ethan carefully accepted the picture. "Thank you." The woman smiled. "Whatever happens, thank you for making people believe again." After she walked away, neither Ethan nor Lily spoke for several moments. The photograph seemed to carry the weight of an entire generation. Across town, Victoria Sterling faced a growing problem she could no longer ignore. Sterling Motors continued experiencing subtle but persistent market shifts. Customer loyalty patterns changed. Independent service providers gained influence. Community perception evolved. During another executive review meeting, one of her advisors delivered an update that caught everyone by surprise. Local consumer surveys now ranked Walker Repair among the most trusted automotive brands in the region. The room fell silent. Victoria stared at the report. She remembered the summit stage. The laughter. The confidence. At the time, Ethan seemed insignificant. Now his name appeared in conversations involving trust, reputation, and future growth. None of it made sense. Not yet. Later that week, the factory auction date was officially announced. The news spread across Fairmont within hours. Local television stations covered the story. Newspapers published feature articles. Online discussions exploded. Everyone wanted to know who would eventually control the massive property. Logistics companies remained interested. Manufacturing firms remained interested. Investors remained interested. The competition had become intense. That evening, Ethan stood inside the factory once again. The setting sun streamed through broken windows, covering the empty production floor in gold and amber light. The vast building remained silent except for the distant sound of wind moving through old ventilation shafts. He slowly walked through the center of the structure, imagining machines running again, employees returning, lights filling spaces that had sat dark for years. Then footsteps echoed behind him. Ethan turned. Harold Benson approached carrying a small folder. "Thought I might find you here." Ethan smiled. "You usually do." Harold handed him the folder. Inside were several newly discovered property records and historical assessments. Useful information. Valuable information. Yet something else caught Ethan's attention. Harold seemed unusually thoughtful. What is it? Ethan asked. The older man looked across the enormous facility. I spent most of my career evaluating opportunities. He paused. Some succeed. Some fail. Ethan listened carefully. Harold continued. The rare ones change entire communities. The words lingered in the fading light. Outside, Fairmont continued speculating about the future. Reporters chased rumors. Investors prepared strategies. Executives monitored developments. Nobody knew exactly how the auction would unfold. Nobody knew who would ultimately gain control of the factory. But one thing was becoming impossible to deny. The small repair shop owner once treated as a joke was no longer being ignored. And as the auction drew closer, even the most powerful people in the city were beginning to pay attention. The week before the auction felt unlike anything Fairmont had experienced in years. Conversations followed the factory everywhere. At coffee shops, grocery stores, church parking lots, and downtown sidewalks, people debated what would happen next. Some believed a national logistics company would win. Others predicted a manufacturing corporation would step in. A few quietly hoped for something different, though most were careful not to say it out loud. Meanwhile, Ethan Walker continued opening his garage every morning at 7 o'clock. Customers still needed repairs. Trucks still broke down. Families still depended on reliable transportation. No matter how large the dream became, he refused to neglect the work that built his reputation in the first place. Yet beneath the routine, pressure continued mounting. The investment group had completed its final evaluations. Financial partners had reviewed projections. Legal teams had prepared documents. Everything now pointed toward a single day, a single decision, a single opportunity that might never come again. One evening, long after the garage closed, Ethan sat alone in the office surrounded by factory plans and financial reports. The room felt smaller than usual. The stacks of paperwork seemed taller. Outside, autumn wind moved through the trees lining the parking lot. Inside, silence filled every corner. For months he had focused entirely on preparation, research, planning, strategy. Now there was nothing left to prepare. The outcome would soon leave his hands. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Lily stepped inside carrying 2 cups of coffee. She sat across from him without saying a word. For several moments neither spoke. Then she looked around the room. Remember when everybody laughed? Ethan smiled faintly. That was not very long ago. Feels like forever. He glanced toward the wall covered in factory photographs. Maybe because a lot has happened. Lily studied him carefully. Do you ever wish you had answered her at the summit? Ethan already knew who she meant. Victoria Sterling. The woman whose public comments had unintentionally set everything in motion. He considered the question for a moment. Then he shook his head. No. Why not? Ethan leaned back in his chair. Because arguing would have changed nothing. Lily nodded slowly. Deep down, she understood. Her father had never tried to win conversations. He preferred building things, fixing things, earning respect instead of demanding it. Across town, Victoria Sterling sat alone in her executive office overlooking the city skyline. Evening lights reflected against the glass walls. Reports covered her desk. Financial forecasts, market analyses, strategic recommendations. Yet despite the workload, her attention kept returning to the same topic. The factory, more specifically, the unusual interests surrounding it. During the previous months, she had watched the city slowly shift. Not dramatically, not overnight, but enough to notice. People talked differently about Ethan Walker now. Customers trusted him. Workers respected him. Community leaders listened to him. The small repair shop owner she once dismissed had become impossible to ignore. That realization unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Several days later, local news stations began broadcasting live coverage leading up to the auction. Reporters interviewed economists, business owners, and former factory employees. Public interest reached levels nobody expected. The abandoned property had become more than real estate. It had become a symbol. For some, it represented economic recovery. For others, community identity. For many former workers, it represented unfinished history. As the attention grew, so did the stakes. On the final evening before the auction, Ethan visited the factory one last time. The gates remained locked. The building stood dark against the fading sky. He parked nearby and walked slowly along the perimeter fence. The air felt cool. Leaves drifted across cracked pavement. Everything seemed unusually quiet. He stopped at a section of fencing overlooking the main production building. For several minutes, he simply stood there. The factory appeared exactly as it had during every previous visit. Yet somehow it felt different. Perhaps because tomorrow would determine its future. Perhaps because dreams always seem most fragile just before they are tested. His phone buzzed. A message from Harold Benson appeared first. Then Frank Delaney. Then several former factory workers. Short messages. Encouragement. Support. Belief. One after another. Ethan read each one carefully. None discussed money. None discussed business. They spoke about hope, community, possibility, things that could never be measured on a balance sheet. Later that night, after Lily had gone to sleep, Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table reviewing a final folder of documents. The house remained silent except for the ticking of an old wall clock. Midnight came and went. Then 1 o'clock. Sleep felt impossible, not because he feared failure, because he understood the responsibility attached to success. Across the city, Victoria remained awake as well. So did investors, executives, developers, and competitors preparing for the morning ahead. Everyone knew the auction would attract attention. Nobody knew exactly how it would end. As darkness settled over Fairmont, the city seemed to hold its breath. The small repair shop still stood beneath its familiar sign. The abandoned factory still waited beyond rusted gates. The people who believed, the people who doubted, the people who laughed, the people who hoped, all of them were moving toward the same moment. And when the sun rose the next morning, the future of the factory would finally begin to reveal itself. The morning of the auction arrived beneath a clear autumn sky. Fairmont seemed quieter than usual, as if the entire city understood that something important was about to happen. Long before the doors opened, people gathered outside the auction venue. Business leaders, investors, reporters, former factory workers, curious residents. Some came for opportunity. Others came for answers. Many came because they wanted to witness history. Ethan Walker arrived early, just as he always did. He wore the same simple suit he reserved for special occasions. Nothing expensive, nothing designed to impress. Beside him walked Lily, who had insisted on being there from the beginning. As they entered the building, conversations softened. Heads turned, not because he was the most powerful person in the room, because he had become the most unexpected. Months earlier, many of those same people laughed when a CEO publicly dismissed his small repair shop. Now they watched him take a seat among investors and corporate executives. The auction began promptly. Numbers appeared on screens. Bidding moved steadily. Several properties sold quickly. Then the factory appeared. The room immediately changed. Energy sharpened. Attention narrowed. Everyone knew this was the centerpiece. The bids started high. Large companies entered immediately. Investment groups followed. The numbers climbed. Reporters typed furiously. Spectators whispered. Ethan remained calm. He listened, observed, waited. One bidder dropped out. Then another. The figures continued rising. Every increase pushed the factory further beyond what most people believed a repair shop owner could ever reach. Yet Ethan never appeared rattled. Months of preparation had brought him here. The ridicule, the sleepless nights, the meetings, the planning, the sacrifices. Every step had led to this room. Eventually, only a handful of serious contenders remained. The atmosphere grew tense. Then, little by little, the field narrowed again. One company withdrew. Another hesitated. Another stopped entirely. Silence settled between each new bid. The room held its breath. Finally, the auctioneer looked across the audience and announced the winning bid. For a moment, nobody reacted. The result seemed to take several seconds to register. Then whispers spread throughout the room. Heads turned. Reporters exchanged stunned glances. Lily looked toward her father with tears gathering in her eyes. Ethan simply sat quietly. The factory belonged to the partnership he had spent months building. The dream had become real. Yet the story did not end there. Over the following months, work began immediately. Cleanup crews arrived. Contractors returned. Lights came back on inside buildings that had remained dark for years. Former employees were invited to share knowledge. New workers joined the project. Local businesses benefited from renewed activity. The forgotten properties slowly awakened. The city watched in amazement. What many dismissed as an impossible idea became visible reality. The greatest surprise came later. Instead of focusing solely on production, Ethan developed a service-centered model connecting repair operations, training programs, specialized manufacturing, and workforce development. Customers responded immediately. Businesses noticed. Opportunities multiplied. Fairmont began changing. Not overnight. Not magically. But steadily. The way meaningful things often do. Meanwhile, Sterling Motors continued facing difficult market conditions. Several divisions were restructured. Costs increased. Growth slowed. Eventually, one of the company's aging facilities was placed on the market as part of a broader strategic adjustment. The announcement generated attention throughout the region. Then another headline followed. The buyer had been identified. When the news reached Fairmont, people could hardly believe it. Ethan Walker and his partners had acquired the property. The same man once mocked for operating a small repair shop, now controlled assets many never imagined he could touch. Yet what stunned people most was not the purchase itself. It was what happened afterward. Ethan kept employees, expanded opportunities, invested in communities, focused on building rather than boasting. He never mentioned the summit, never referenced the insult, never sought revenge. Several months later, during a community event celebrating the factory's reopening, hundreds of residents gathered inside the restored facility. Families walked through bright production areas. Former workers shared memories. Young apprentices learned new skills. Hope-filled spaces once abandoned. Among the guests stood Victoria Sterling. She had accepted an invitation quietly. No cameras followed her. No speeches were planned. At one point, she found Ethan standing near the same production floor that had sat empty for years. For a few moments, neither spoke. Then Victoria looked around the bustling facility. "I was wrong about you." Ethan smiled gently. "A lot of people were." She nodded. "Why did you never respond?" He looked across the crowd. Workers, families, students, children, possibility. Because proving people wrong is temporary. His voice remained calm. Building something meaningful lasts longer. Victoria lowered her eyes. The answer carried no arrogance, no bitterness, only truth. As the evening continued, laughter echoed through the factory. Lights reflected from polished equipment. The city celebrated not a victory over someone else, but a victory for itself. Months earlier, a small repair shop owner had been treated as a joke. Now he stood surrounded by people whose lives had improved because he chose persistence over pride and purpose over revenge. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. The strongest people do not rise by tearing others down. They rise by refusing to let other people define their limits. If this story stayed with you, share your thoughts below and tell us about a time perseverance changed your life. And if you believe dignity, second chances, and quiet strength still matter, we would be honored to have you join us again for another story.